This episode of the Digital Instruction Network is sponsored by REMC Association of Michigan. For more than 50 years, they have been providing digital media services as well as educator professional learning to educators and schools all over the state of Michigan. For more information on their programs, including the 21 Things program, the Classroom Makers program, and Playdates, please visit remc.org. That's REMC.org. Well, welcome back. This is 517 EdTech's Digital Instruction Network, and this is episode 12. I am Andrew Shaver, instruction and technology coach at Ingham ISD, joined, of course, by the legendary Christy Lobdell, assistive technology at Eaton Risa, and Allison Rogers, aka Allison the Great, at Clinton County Risa, instructional technology specialist up there. And we are joined today by Dan Wizner, who is a high school social studies and a little bit of chemistry teacher at DeWitt High School in DeWitt, Michigan. How are we doing, Dan?
Doing well. I'm excited to be here. Yeah.
Good. So today, we are going to talk a little bit about how instruction has to kind of go back and forth between the virtual space and the face-to-face space. Of course, now here that we're recording this on January 13th in Michigan, and we're starting to hear schools that previously had been remote starting to talk about going back in to face-to-face settings. Of course, we've had schools that have been in some manner of hybrid or face-to-face settings for much of the school year, and so we're going to spend some time talking about that flexibility in terms of how we are creating instruction that doesn't make us have to do two or three different things, creating something that can flex. We're also going to talk about gamification, opportunities for the students to collaborate with each other. We're going to talk about universal design, opportunities for choice, the use of projects and the ways that these have enhanced the remote and hybrid learning. And then we're going to start visioning forward to what this might look like once students come back to the classroom, which they eventually will. There's no doubt about that. So, so welcome, Dan. I'm glad we're glad you were able to take some time out of your day to have some conversations with us.
Yeah, we're glad to be here, and obviously, being at DeWitt High School, we've seen a lot of different instructional models happen as far as schedules based on COVID. We had been completely virtual K-12 since the end of October, and today being Wednesday, next Tuesday we'll actually return to an in-person instructional model, and we'll see how that goes. We've got it planned out and we're ready. Just kind of putting those finishing touches on how to make sure things go as smoothly as possible.
So prior to October, were you guys in a more traditional-ish face-to-face setting, or were you hybrid? Were you a couple days a week? Like, what did it look like before October?
So before October, we kind of had a little bit of everything in that when we did have in-person instruction, we also had students who were fully online at home, but still enrolled in our classroom. So a lot of that involved either creating asynchronous material for them to do while students in the classroom were working, or trying to be dual purposed and have a live meet going and guiding both online instruction while in-person instruction happened. I believe we had 2 days of our fully in-person return before some COVID tracing ended up knocking our district out. And then, of course, from there, COVID rates had increased to the point where the district continued to keep us out. So, if anything, we've learned how to be flexible and had to depend on a lot of the technology tools that as of last January, maybe we were just starting to know about, or had no idea even existed.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about that flexibility. So, I mean, obviously in March everything kind of shut down somewhat abruptly, so we kind of walked that path a little bit once before, but when you talk about the flexibility in your instruction, can you give a sense of maybe what that looked like, not only structurally but also maybe some of the tools that you leaned into a little bit to help make that happen?
Yeah, so at DeWitt High School, we use a lot of the Google tools, and Google Classroom is our learning system that we use, our LMS. And so what I've really found and had depended on since March is having to use that LMS, Google Classroom, to be really organized in both the structure of what we're doing and the learning targets that we need to hit and the outcomes and even measuring those materials. So what we found is the more organized we've been in there, and I know Laura Forback had spoken previously, and she's kind of our go-to for everything tech when we have questions from having taught across the hall from her a few years ago. And so what we found is it's a lot easier to be flexible when you have that organization, because students know where to go to find what's due. They can look at some of the to-do lists that exist in Google Classroom. For myself and my own planning, I try to keep a hyperdoc that has links to all materials, both supplemental and required. And I started venturing into using more Bitmojis and getting into a little bit more of the creative component. And I even have like a coding system of emojis of, if it's a due assignment, we put a green check mark. If it is a supplemental reading, we put a little picture of a book next to it, just so that students kind of get some of that consistency, but also that visual stimuli. And what I found is whether we're online, whether we're hybrid, whether we're in person, a lot of those hyperdocs of materials are a really nice benefit. And for a parent who might have a struggling student and they need to have a little bit more assistance, that document's fantastic for being able to share. And for students who are independent, they still have that one central location that just each week hyperdoc goes live in Google Classroom, and they can access and know what's coming or what's been done, depending on absences. And obviously with contact tracing, that's going to become a continued issue. Like students are going to miss time in class. And when that happens, hoping that can be a way to at least help guide them and keep them from falling behind.
Well, and they always did. Like that's the
Yeah.
thing that is like, it may not be that suddenly a kid who is not symptomatic of any actual illness that's manifesting itself has to miss 2 weeks of school very suddenly. Like that maybe is something that was not all that common before, the stretch we're in now. But at the same time, there were always kids missing. There
Yep.
were always kids who would miss several days of school. I remember I had several instances where, a student would have to miss a week because their parent, who was overseas um, in the military, was getting a 2 week time to come home, and they wanted to go up to the cabin or something. Well, this
Yeah.
is the only time that dad's been home, and this is the only time dad will be home, and it happened to be in the middle of May. So we're going to take the kid out of school for a week. It's very difficult for me to argue with that. That seems like perfectly reasonable thing for a family to do. So creating the mechanisms where the student still has the ability to do those things that their life kind of puts in front of them without completely going full blackout from school and coming back wildly behind and lost is something that probably we should have as a system spent more time focused on prior to this time now. And so that we have developed the ability through necessity to kind of build those structures in, I would hope is going to pay some dividends moving forward.
Yeah, it sounds like the system you have in place, Dan, is going to seamlessly transition whether your students are in person or virtual. And I've been hearing that more and more from teachers is that, the practices that they've implemented since March are actually enhancing just this system, the process of sharing information. It's that concept of, anytime, any place, anywhere, students can access materials. So these limits that we had before, we're now breaking down those barriers because we were forced to, and now we might continue to adopt those moving forward. So my question to you, Dan, is, you clearly are rocking and rolling now. Your students are acclimated with your process and your system, but what steps did you have to take, or what supports did you have to provide to those students to ensure that they understood the routine and got comfortable and, had the appropriate technology knowledge for them to be able to be where they're at now?
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I'm excited because to answer that question, like I have content and actions I took, but I also know that every grade level below me did as well. And so it's going to be a skill to build on. Like where my second grader is taking screenshots and embedding them in a Google slide and then importing it and then wanting to check if his work was assessed. Loom, I became much better at using Loom to be able to screencast and just be able to do some of those tutorials, whether it be, hey, here's how you access a document, or we're going to ask you to maybe do a skill that you haven't done before. So let's screencast how that should look when you're first entering this platform, this program. The other thing that's been kind of beneficial is in small settings or small groups, giving them the option to screen share and actually kind of troubleshoot through how to access and enter. Like I know I've had more than a few instances in a formative assessment. I used Illuminate and really love the tools there, but you'll have students that when you give them the password to get in, they sometimes have used that for their username, or rather than the pre-created account that goes through their Google account through DeWitt Schools, they would actually try to type in their name and password. So them screen sharing is such a simple solution. And I think I had to create a Loom to show them how to screen share at first in March, but now it's just second nature, and they go, oh yeah, here's my screen. Oh, do this, and they're like, thanks, I'm good. So I think part of it's there. And then my brother-in-law is not in education, but he's like, he loves technology. And I think the best advice he gave me a while ago was, you're not going to break it. Like the worst thing you can do is have to reset the settings. And so don't be afraid of that exploring and figuring out how this platform works or how this website works. Because again, it's not this fragile tool that'll all of a sudden be permanently undone. And I think giving students that concept, although a lot of them have that and are intuitive, like my 2-year-old who now can function at a touch screen no problem, but doesn't even know what a keyboard is. Like it's in they're digital natives, like we used that phrase from a while ago, but they truly are, and therefore have adapted. But man, screen sharing has been wonderful, and videos like Loom, which is the platform we've used, has been a savior.
Yeah, and I think you're highlighting something that is makes sense when you say it out loud, but in the moment, oftentimes people have to be reminded, and that is that when you add a thing, you're never just adding one thing.
Right.
Like if we're gonna add a pair deck, for example, and the students are gonna engage pair deck, we get fooled sometimes into thinking we're adding just pair deck. We're not adding just pair deck. We're adding a new login. We're adding a new interface. We're adding a new click sequence. We're adding new ways of turning things in. New ways of checking your work afterwards to see what grade you got on it. I mean, like if it's graded, right? These kinds of things are, those are things teachers have to remember in terms of working with their students. And those are things that support folks like me and Allison and Christy have to keep in mind when we're working with adult learners.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to model things. We can't just, spring them on folks and say, okay, do it. And this explicitly teaching things that might seem very simple or very obvious, if you don't have that base context or that foundational skill, especially when it comes to technology, suddenly your student or your participant is being assessed or tried on knowing the technology and not the actual content. So getting everybody to that place. And it sounds like this pandemic experience has sort of facilitated to fill in those gaps of that technology learning that needed to happen for multiple grade levels. So maybe a little teeny silver lining.
Yeah, and oftentimes too, and I'll have teachers that'll say, well, the students really struggle with this tool or that tool, and that certainly is true. It is also true that the students with enough time and experience will probably not struggle if they're taught how to use it. And if it's a tool worth using, it is important to take the time, like you were saying, to screencast or to teach explicitly the little things that it's going to take to get you into this. Even things like, I'm going to show you how to share your screen because I'm going to have to help you troubleshoot this thing. And if you're having to use the words that you've got to describe what you're seeing on your screen and it doesn't make sense to me, we're sunk. So it might be helpful for us both to be looking at the same thing, but I know I'm going to have to teach you guys to do that. That's an investment that you're making, envisioning out a problem that's going to be a problem and setting the stage for that problem to have an easy resolution, as opposed to waiting for it to be a problem. And now you might be in a time crunch, or the stress is on, or the student's panicking, or you're getting frustrated, or it's late, or whatever. And you just pre-think that stuff and say, okay, here's the reality of the world I'm trying to build. What types of skills are my students going to need to engage that reality well? And then I've got to teach them how to have those skills so that they do.
And I think that's an important maybe thing I've learned, or at least had reinforced, is that like teaching technology doesn't necessarily happen as directly as maybe it would have a decade ago. Like we don't have as many technology electives as uh, maybe we once did. And like I always loved the typing class I always took as a kid. That was always fantastic. But it becomes one of those things where history for me or social studies, depending on the content, is a vehicle, but like the skill sets that can get learned go far beyond that. Like it's much more complex than just being able to analyze a primary source, because it's accessing digitally, corresponding, having higher order thinking. And so the education, like I think there's an opportunity within this setting to really uh, make it a more full education that like we might talk about in a little bit, but it gets in that idea of meeting students where they're at, both with skill set, but then also with interest.
Well, and I think too, sorry, Allison, but there is something that is to be said for some of those skills that we've been wanting the students to have seeming more or less arbitrary now and more authentic. The need for those skills is right there, and it's fairly obvious for a lot of students to see. And it's not just the tech skills. I had a teacher that I was talking to um, last week. She teaches high school science in one of the districts I support. And she was saying that her students, she's even surprised at how much better they're getting at writing emails. They're being polite, they're saying please, they're using capital letters and punctuation. Like, it's not, because it doesn't seem arbitrary now. If you write the email poorly, the teacher doesn't understand what you're saying, and it takes longer to get yourself unconfused. And so by slowing down, by using the proper technique for written communication, for speaking with the audience in mind, you actually have a dog in that fight because you've got a problem that needs a solution. And so it's like built in a lot of those little like under the radar skills that make life easier for everybody, but always, not always, but like sometimes teachers had a hard time making seem non-arbitrary to students. And I hadn't even thought of that. When she wrote that in an email, I was doing a check-in and she wrote that back. I could not quite, I had not, so that surprised me. That surprised me.
Yeah, it's almost like I'm seeing like the MyTex competencies or the ISTE standards or any sort of technology skill set standard has always sort of seemed separate. And I think Andrew and Christy specifically, you can speak to this, that I think we're getting better at it now, but there was a time when technology was in one silo and instruction was in another. And obviously we're now blending that and sometimes maybe forced to do that specifically this year. But I think that's a really, really great thing. And my question to you, Dan, is how have you seen students maybe who were initially not so comfortable with technology? How have they grown? Are you seeing students with a little bit more autonomy? And you've talked about in the past with us, really utilizing the concept of student choice. How do you see that maybe help students who are maybe less comfortable with, showing their work in a traditional sense? Are you seeing more creativity? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think one of the things you're seeing, or at least I'm starting to see, is like I remember we had limited computer lab space and we weren't a one-to-one district, and so that's kind of a barrier that's been broken down with some Herculean effort by our technology department, and as well with families at home. But with that collective effort, like it's fantastic in that it's now a lot easier to cover a content, teach a topic, but then to let them go explore further. So like in a world history setting, when we were studying the Holocaust, with the structure of our day and what we had been doing in virtual learning is we are a 4x4 block schedule. And so we have long class periods, but we don't meet on Wednesdays. And so we really lost one instructional day each week. So we kind of gave students the base of, here are some of the events of the Holocaust, here are some of the atrocities. But the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum website is incredibly well done for student learning. And so we let them just go and explore for a good chunk of class time a topic. And their requirement at the end was to report back, one, the main idea of what they learned, two, what caused them to be interested in that topic, and then three, what might be good in a bullet point way for classmates to take. So they have to synthesize that content. So I think in a history setting, and it can go into other content areas, it's that concept of the barrier is gone of independent research Obviously, like we had said with the technology, sometimes they still need that explicit start of instruction to get a base. But when that base is there, we can now let that interest thrive because they have the resources and are building the research skills.
I love that activity because it's not dependent upon the content, right? You could have given any specific historical event. I used to say the same thing in teaching English, that, you know, we're reading a novel or an informational text, but that's just the vehicle to enhance and learn the skill set that we're trying to do here. And so that, I mean, you could really do that lesson in all subject areas, I would imagine.
Yeah, so I kind of want to get into that. So I call it an Aglo day. So it's a little bit, it's a Green Brothers story, but John Green, when he gave a TED talk, talked about how he used to see education and learning as just a series of hurdles to jump over, and it was just bothered him because there's always another hurdle, until he eventually saw learning kind of like a coastline, and like there's a coastline to an explorer, and if you don't like that coastline, well, there's more coastline to explore, but if you do like it, you know, you can go in and you can really get into depth. And so in the book Paper Towns, he mentioned the city of Aglo, and it was a fake city in which a map maker created, because if you make the perfect map, obviously the copy of that map is also perfect. So it's a way to prevent copyrights it's just a way to protect copyright infringement for a map maker. So Aglo was a city. And the way that John Green explained it is the map maker put Aglo on, which is a combination of two of the map makers. A decade later, saw a map that had the city Aglo on it, and they're like, "We got you! Like, you completely plagiarized our map." Boom! But it turns out that this map was accurate. Some corporation saw that Aglo, New York, was on this intersection, and it made sense, and they put a gas station there. And because a gas station went there, a supermarket went across the street, and it's like this tiny, tiny small town. Which, you know, we get those in Michigan, right? The party store town that's on one intersection. So it existed, like out of nothing, it became a town. So they didn't plagiarize. And so I had heard of an activity called FedEx Day where you can explore anything you want, but you have to ship it at the end. And so I switched it to be called an Aglo Day so that they can explore something of their interest. And so we try to do those every so often because generally in world history, there's something that any student will love, right? Like there's just too much to it to not have a student love something in the content. But it's not always the material we're covering that week. And so those Aglo days, I think sometimes just rejuvenate or allow you to get to know a student better when it comes to examples you're giving in class or content that's going to be covered. So that's another way to try to just help students kind of take ownership of their learning is activities like that. And now with online resources and shared templates through making a Google assignment, you can give them a sweet template. They can make it their own in their own unique way with what they've learned and have a cool product at the end.
I see that too. You know, you're talking about your Wednesdays and how they explore the Holocaust Museum. Now your Aglo days. I see those days too as being beneficial when in-person learning occurs as well. But I see the format that we're in now allowing students, like Allison was saying, to go down an area in which they're more comfortable in for responding. So maybe in person, you're like, all right, here's the worksheet. We're going to explore the Holocaust Museum, or here's the Google Doc, share what you learned. But now we have all these other avenues and ways for students to share with us what they've learned. And so I'm kind of curious. I know you've shared with us in the past that you've had, different ways for students to either collaborate on projects or to share with you what they have then learned, whether it's something that they were assigned or whether it's something that they are exploring on their own. So what are some other tools that you're pulling in to allow students to be able to truly, share what they've learned?
Yeah, Google Slides, this is such a usable medium in which to show work because they like making the presentations, but then teaching them that skill set of what an effective presentation is just one, because I know, especially in history, you can get that like 15 bullet point text heavy slide and just kind of teaching them how to do that component better. We've used why did I just go blank on the name? Jamboard. Jamboard has been kind of a fun new one that was, I think you guys at the conference in August, like used Jamboard. I was like my first Jamboard experience. Like, this is great. Like, why haven't I needed to know how to do this. And so that's been a great way both to summarize, but then to let student groups actually branch out because it can get used in a breakout room where maybe a small group's discussing, but the note taker would rather insert a few pictures and sticky notes, or they all want to take notes simultaneously. But that's another way you can show assessment. And just fluency in writing, and just the ability of students to then give that written response is fantastic. And kind of to understand the limitations of and strengths of spell check. And like we had said in the kind of the email conversation, how do you communicate effectively and efficiently in an online setting? And that's a skill that out of necessity students have had to do, because that ability to just verbally share or depend on another to take notes is limited, but you also get that immediate feedback and practice every day in your written fluency.
Not only just because they're doing this because they have to, not because we've sat down and taught them these skills, but now they are taking the risks. Like you said, it's not going to break. I think that was your brother-in-law who said it's not going to break. Students have the same mentality. They know it's not going to break. They're going to push all the buttons and try all the things until it does what they want it to do for them. And so they're writing the emails, whether it's through using, voice typing, turning on dictation on their Chromebook, traditional means of typing, and then going back and using spell check to correct it. Maybe a quick little video embedding. They're doing all these things because they know they are going to find a way to make it work for them, whether that specific feature or skill has been taught to them or not. They're going to push all the buttons and figure out how to make it work for them.
Since we last spoke, Dan, you had said that you had rolled out your Fantasy Government League activity, and I've been dying to hear how that turned out and, who won the Fantasy League.
Yeah, I got sixth. I did not win. So my method of looking actually at the congressional record and kind of seeing like what was getting proposed, that went awry. So I was not victorious. But yeah, so we did a Fantasy Congress League in which you get points through this website for legislation that is proposed, legislation that gets past the House, past the Senate, and then signed into law. Which I think for the students, it was a good learning experience to realize that there are a lot more post offices being renamed, and that happens a lot more frequently than maybe major legislation that would make it through into their, into TikTok or into their feeds online and social media. So it was a great experience. And then we did that. And then we built into that platform, one of the people, their individuals who was part of their Fantasy Congress team, they had to then create a 2022 election campaign to try to win a seat in that district. And that was kind of their summarizing project for the US Gov. So it ended up going pretty well. I think some got really involved and some didn't. It's kind of like playing with fantasy football with your friends from back home. Like some people are checking the waiver wire at 3 a.m. and other people forgot that they had a lineup to set and started 2 running backs from the same team on bye week.
That's hyper specific. I'm sorry that you did that.
If any of my friends are watching that, they know who that guy is. Right? That was a new league rule after that week. He won. Started 2 running backs on bye and won. Oh,
well, then I don't know why you outlawed it. It's clearly a winning strategy.
It's the law.
But no, so these three, you've given 3-4 good examples here. And they have in my opinion, at least, if I'm synthesizing them, they have some components that are consistent, and that is that you're giving students freedom and flexibility where you want them to learn, which would be the content, the communication, the storytelling, the report out, right? The product creation. That's where you want their energy placed in those things. Mm-hmm. And you're doing some of the heavier lifting with respect to the places that you don't want them getting caught up, which is what tool are you going to use? Okay, I'll share with you out a template, or I'll teach you how to use these tools. It's like these tools are going to become vehicles for you guys to learn social studies content. So I'll teach you how to do all the stuff. I don't need you to worry about investing time in learning.
Yes.
You guys then, though, the trade-off is I need you to invest your time and energy to looking at 2 or 3 primary sources or however, synthesizing all of that and creating a coherent report out. And that's an essential component to a lot of things. But history, I think, has a unique stake in that, because creating a narrative out of a couple of primary sources can be quite tricky, but is absolutely essential to communicating the historicity of that moment to another human being. And then the fact that they're having to do that like virtually, meaning that they've got to type, they've got to choose their words. They can't rely on, the one kid who seems to understand it best in the group doing all the work. Like there's a lot of reasons why the way in you're taxing them with that structure is taxing them in the ways that is designed to build in the best knowledge of the content, as far as that goes, at least as far as I can tell. How have they been doing with it? Like, would you say that you're getting good response? Would you say you're getting surprisingly good response? Would you say it's like with fantasy, you've got half and half for each one, so I've got to do these, fairly regularly so that I can vary it up, because I only ever get half my kids to do well with any one? I mean, like, what would you say the student response has been?
I'd say good to mixed maybe would be a way to kind of respond to that. When you were mentioning that question, it made me think of like the most humbling experience in my teaching career. When I moved from DeWitt Junior High, we're now DeWitt Middle School. For whatever reason, I ended up looping with they're currently juniors, but I looped with that group. And so they were kids that had me for 7th grade social studies. And we learned about the factors of civilizations and how the earliest civilizations had navigable rivers and beasts of burden and kind of that component. And then of course, I had a lot of them for 8th grade US history, and we learned about all these complex things and these learning targets. And I get them for 9th grade history, and I go into a first day, I'm like, let's review your middle school content. And like, nobody could remember the 4 factors of a river valley. And I was like, all right, tell me about the Compromise of 1850. And it was like crickets. And I'm like, who even taught you in middle school? They're like, you did.
That's right.
And so I think it was a great experience for me, because I feel like every level from college all the way down, I'm sure, is always like, well, what did these kids even do last? Like, how do they not have this skill set?
And
the
answer all broadcast, no reception.
Right. And so like, I'm like, oh, I gotta call that teacher. And they're joking around like,
That's
that was you. I'm like, I know. But I think what it helped me to realize is that they're not going to remember a lot of the factual information in a historical setting unless it's something they use frequently. But they often remember those experiences, and they remember things in which they had an interest, or they had this epic win because they uncovered or did something they didn't know they could otherwise do, whether it's creating a product, being able to be intelligent about informing their parents, their family members about this complex historical topic that ties into today. So in that whole setting, like that's kind of shifted my mindset to, it's not about how much of the history I can get them to know now. It's how much can I get them to retain. And like you said, with those vehicles, when they get to a college history class, they've probably forgotten a lot of our World War II content we just covered last week or 2 weeks ago. But if they know how to use vehicles, whether that be search engines appropriately, or be able to research and then synthesize, I think that skill is going to be necessary, because in reality, every time I go back to a unit, I brush up on my content so that I can speak to it accurately. And so that's kind of my mindset of teach them how to learn, and they're going to be fine. If I just force them to learn something, they'll forget pretty quickly and move on.
Well, that's the essence of engaging the current like socio-political landscape on your Twitter feed, for example. If you have any variety in the least on your Twitter feed, the chances are when any even semi-major event happens, you're going to get several different takes immediately, several different takes in the midterm, and then several different takes further away from the event. And they're all going to have unique flavors to them. And so just even being able to, in your day-to-day, making sense of what's happening around you, you're going to need to be able to take multiple takes, synthesize it into a coherent narrative, and then be able to sense make with that narrative to update it as new information comes in, which is not all that different from historically researching a past event. I mean, that's the same basic skill set. And then the idea of stealing, like we used to do this in math when I taught geometry, we would build in structures that we knew were more engaging structures because we knew the content couldn't carry the day. There's only so much I can do with angle similarity. I can't make that very exciting. It's not deep. It's not all that applicable. It's just content. So the lesson had better be interesting, because if the content's boring and the lesson's boring, it's just skip the day. Let's just put on a Disney movie. That's that understanding that you built in then carries into back to the face-to-face, because that's not different. I don't care what method you're teaching on. If your content isn't all that exciting, your lesson's going to have to pick up the slack. Your lesson can be a little more straightforward when the content is more interesting. That's just a basic fact of teaching.
I used to teach an elective that was all based on simulations. And so that's kind of where gamification kind of made its way into my life as a teacher. And I haven't effectively got it everywhere at a high school level yet, but I'm working on just trying to make it more competitive in nature, or letting them have this simulation and then breaking it into what life looks like in reality compared to how the simulation went.
Yeah. Yeah. Gamification is something that I have observed is easy to get wrong.
Yes.
Like when it works well, it's really, really good. But it's like what did Woody Hayes say when people would ask him why he doesn't pass the ball more? He's like, whenever you drop back to pass, there's 4 things that could happen and 3 of them are bad.
Yeah.
And it's like, to me with gamification, it's like the boundary lines are really narrow and there's big wide ditches on either side that it's very easy to slide into.
Here's our example. We had a teacher who had retired, but he had these extensive simulations. And I had a student who had that teacher in like 3 classes. I'm like, hey, for our American Indian history class, can you build a Beaver War simulation for us? Like that was his final paper. Everyone else did a research paper. This kid made a Beavers War simulation and had it all set up and had the different parties, interests, geographic regions. But we didn't realize that we didn't account for on our game map anybody to check Russia. So Russia ended up dominating North America. So our simulation ended with the Russian domination of the fur trade in North America and colonized the entire continent. We're like, so that's not even founded in any kind of reality ever.
That's not what happened.
Right. So we had to rewrite that game script. That one, that was a lot of unteaching.
I like it. Well, and I thought there's some interesting things you can actually do even with that mistake, because the question of, does like Tsarist Imperial Russia, would they have, had they had the opportunity, taken over North America? I don't know the answer to that, but the answer is not certainly no. There's a chance that may have happened. So there's something to be said for the question of, well, in reality, they didn't. Why didn't they? Is it because they didn't want to? Is it because we were doing something to deter it? Is it because we had a treaty with them? Is it because, I mean, like, what were they? Was there trouble back home at that time that kept them occupied? Like, so there's actually even something to be said for that.
I know the quote that I heard from Eric Foner, and I think he had it from elsewhere, but history is never certain until it is. That comes up in gamification of historical settings, right? Like so many little things can take place that can change the essence of history, that to really look back and study it, it's sometimes a microcosm. Like we just, it was a story, it wasn't a simulation or gamification, but there was a Russian officer on one of their submarines, and in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this only came out about 20 years ago, they needed 2 out of 3 officers to give the okay to send a nuclear torpedo at a U.S. naval vessel that was dropping depth charges, and one of the 3 individuals refused to consent to sending that torpedo. Had they sent that torpedo, that was a nuclear warhead at a U.S. naval vessel, and we're most likely, Cuban Missile Crisis is the beginning of that conflict becoming a world war. Like, history pivoted on that one person's decision. Like, we're that close to a nuclear war, and I think that's one aspect of history that can help kids to get interested in maybe things that would have otherwise seemed like an uninteresting topic. Like, they all want to learn about World War II. Like, they know how much of a challenge that was, or how great the sacrifices were, but they sometimes don't realize that the steps leading up to that also pivoted very, very, in a very small action that could have had a significant change in the outcome.
Yeah, no, and it's the same thing, like with the growing number of people who are skeptical about the reality of us actually having landed on the moon, has a lot to do with the fact, and this is commentary I borrowed from Bill Whittle, who gave a great podcast on Apollo 11 for the 50th anniversary, but he said anybody who was there live following the events building up to that, they don't doubt it in the least, because it was incrementalism of the highest order. First, we were going to see if we could get a rocket to go up to space without blowing up. Okay. Then we were going to see if we could get it back. Okay. Then we were going to see if we could send a sentient creature of any kind. So we sent, the Russians sent a dog, we sent a chimp. Okay.
That was a Jeopardy answer last night.
Was it?
Yeah, it really was. Sorry.
Nice.
Yeah.
You know, but then every little step, okay, can we send a human up there and back? Okay, can we send a human up there for a little bit further and back? Okay, can we orbit them and back? Okay, can we dock a thing and back? Okay, and all these little pieces, and then next thing you know, we're on the moon. I mean, anybody who was there, it doesn't seem like it's crazy when the only thing that's in front of you is the next little step. And those are the things that there's two things going on there. First, to some people, that makes history a slog to get through because there's a lot of mundaneness in there. To other people, that's what makes history approachable. You know, the fact that armies don't just invade other places, they invade other places for reasons. And in general, those aren't usually, especially in the classical world, massively difficult geopolitical reasons. They've got more natural resources. We want those natural resources. They're not selling them to us. So we're going to send our army over there and take them. That's schoolyard negotiations right there. It's just, we're doing it with swords. And so, you know, to some degree, I think some of that approachability can make this stuff seem less mystical to students. And like the narrative is a little bit easier for them to understand and retell than maybe they thought.
Yeah, I think maybe one thing to talk about too would be that return to the in-person instruction and maybe how some of these actions learned through 2020 and attending online seminars and collaborating with teachers and platforms are using or activities they're using. Like now that we return to in-person, like the students still have some of those skill sets. And so when it comes to our classroom structure, I think it's just reinforcing that we can still be creative, or students still have those tech skills, but need to use them. I think if we were to fall back into previous patterns, we could potentially digress some of those either creative skill sets or technological inquiry as students have learned how to kind of manage new platforms and make sense of new rules of how do you appropriately behave in a video or in a screencast, or how do you appropriately behave in sending emails. So I think it's still not treating obviously your in-person students as if they're virtual and just sitting there quietly as you're all on your own device. But at the same time, I think it's still trying to keep some of those virtual communities alive, and that either different classes within a building can now more easily collaborate because we know how. We've always said, how do we cross-curricular plan or even work? Well, we know how now. We breakout rooms and Google Meets, and one teacher can be constructing the online while the other person has the in-person. Obviously, with social distancing, we have to be careful of the in-person for a long period of time till we have that. But I guess it's the hope is that as we go through this next phase, to just still stay really positive through the challenges of with protocol for safety. How do we also keep education being an authentic and exciting and new experience for students and for teachers?
Like the teacher being able to genuinely say to the student, look, you have no reason why we can't find you a way that you can get this process started. I assure you, we can make it so that there's not as much reading in it. We can make it so that it's easier for you to write answers. We can make it so that the materials are better suited to the device you're on. We've got practice now doing all those adjustments. And so now the teachers have the ability to make those adjustments and need to, and the students now have a sort of a less of a reason to fall back on any type of, I don't know how you say, like excuse that I can't do this. Like, no, you can. Like now we've got the practice. Now we've got a way to do that. Well, you know, I think one of the things that has come out of this is is an authentic view of the reality of the situation, which has forced us to focus on the primary goals. And the primary goals are that students learn history well, or learn these social studies topics well, or learn these chemistry topics well. That's the goal. We've got these tools that are built to help, okay? And we've got, if they're going to use them, they have to learn how to use them, and that's fine. But like, how do you craft an experience so that the students want to engage the content? And I think that that's been, I think focusing on that experience of how are we going to get our students to buy into content that may not necessarily grab their attention immediately, just on its own. Okay, we're going to have to build in some competitive elements possibly. We're going to have to build in a lot of choice possibly. We're going to have to give them some flexibility in terms of what the product looks like. We're going to have to be authentic on what we're assessing. We're going to have to make sure that what they're struggling with is content and not technology. Like, all of these things that feel like at times like maybe they could risk becoming like a checklist with boxes are begin to make perfect holistic sense when the goal is the students will learn this content well. All that other stuff then becomes the supporting elements to get to that big goal. And that's what's come out of this. That understanding is not relegated to a remote or a hybrid or a face-to-face. That's teaching, what it looks like. And so I think that has come out loud and clear. I think the success that you are experiencing stems, no doubt, from your ability to build relationships with students, because the experiences you're giving them are authentic and are built in for the students to very easily see that they've got one real goal in mind, and that is that they learn that content well. That's it. So, good job. We just did an hour. That was good. All right. Let's go around the table and wrap up. Christy, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, you summarized that so well, Andrew. I think no matter in what environment we are in for school, there are always barriers. The barriers that students face in person, remotely, are sometimes the same. Sometimes they vary though, but I think that you've done an awesome job with breaking down those barriers, which so often, come from material being presented in one standard way, or responses being expected to be given in one standard way. So I think so many of those barriers can be broken down by the things that you're just naturally embedding into your teaching, which is, the choice making, the creativity piece. And so, you talked about too, how looking back, your students are gonna remember these experiences. And because you've made the experiences fun and creative and exciting, they'll also remember the content that surrounded that experience too. So, I mean, ultimate goal right there. Thanks for sharing everything you did with us today.
So thanks for joining us today, Dan. It was really nice to get a window into, your day-to-day, what it looks like in your classroom, especially since we've all adjusted since March. But I think the biggest takeaway is similarly to Christy in that, you set your class up that it can translate easily in person, virtual, whatever environment is needed at the time. And I think the opportunity for student choice is very valuable, but not just giving them choice to share what they know, but you've set up systems in place, you've created a culture that's comfortable, you've given them the foundational technology skills. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that you clearly have set up a relationship with students that they feel safe to be able to try these new things and show what they've learned in a creative and maybe unique manner. So thank you for sharing your experiences. And I have to say that I think that if you were a student in your social studies class, it would be very, very interesting. I am a history buff, but I'd love to be in Mr. Wizner's class.
I think in reality, it's been the fact that I've had to learn as much as the students in order to be able to adapt to this environment. And it's been both vulnerable to have to use a platform and ask the students how that went. But I think that's helped to build that trust when they see you experimenting, like, hey, maybe this would be a really good tool for us. Let's try it. And then let me know how you perceive this learning outcome. So I think that's the other kind of wrap up piece to build that trust and to be able to get to that creativity is sometimes you're going to do and try actions that don't go that well. And it's allowing the students to have that comfortable feedback where they can critique, but also, a chance to maybe find something that really is a great experience for everybody, teacher and student included.
Dan Wizner, high school social studies and chemistry teacher at DeWitt High School in DeWitt, Michigan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Be sure to check out the full playlist of the 517 EdTech Digital Instruction Network. We are recording season 3 right now, so check out that playlist for more to be added. You can also check out our 517 EdTech site for all of that as well. Be sure to follow us on Twitter. And if you'd like to join our 517 EdTech mailing list, check out this link here.